Hello, this is new motivate story. Let's go start it.
The silence of the bell. In the highlands of Japan, nestled between whispering bamboo groves and the murmurs of a river that had long forgotten its source, stood a small Zen monastery. The wind here carried the scent of pine and the low hum of time itself. It was here that Akira, a young novice, had come seeking something he could not name. He was not born into the tradition. Akira had once lived in Edo, a city of crowds and noise and ink-stained ledgers. His family was part of the merchant class, rising with the tide of wealth, but Akira felt empty even as his hands counted coins. One evening, after witnessing a monk silently bow to the setting sun as though it were a god, Akira felt something stir in him, a fire, small and flickering. A question: why do I do what I do? That night, he packed a small satchel and walked away from the city without telling anyone. The monastery was cold, the routines austere. They rose before the sun, ate in silence, and meditated for hours on hard floors. Akira's legs ached, and his mind wandered endlessly. He thought of home, of meals with laughter, of warm futons and the touch of silk. But something, perhaps pride, perhaps something more sacred, kept him there. The abbot, a man known only as Ryushin, was gentle and hard as stone. He rarely spoke to the novices, believing in the power of silence. When he did speak, his words were brief but pierced like an arrow. One morning, as snow fell in sheets around the temple, Akira found himself alone with Ryushin during firewood duty. The elder monk was splitting logs with calm precision. Akira, still burning from his latest failed attempt at prolonged zazen, finally broke the silence. "Why do we do this, master? Sit and suffer, day after day. Is it for the gods? For enlightenment?" Ryushin paused mid-swing, looking at Akira. "Do you suffer?" Akira hesitated. "Yes." "Then that is your teacher," Ryushin said simply. He returned to chopping, but added, "The gods need nothing from you. Enlightenment is not something you do. It is what remains when all your doing ends." Akira did not understand then, but something in the words rang true, like the low gong that marked the end of meditation, vibrating deep in his bones. Part 2. The Spark of Reason. Thousands of miles away and centuries later, in the salons of Berlin, another seeker was beginning his own journey. Johannes Keller was a student of philosophy, ambitious and skeptical. He read voraciously Plato, Aquinas, Descartes, but it was Kant who lit the fire in his mind. Autonomy. The word itself glowed. In a world where the church had long dictated the rhythm of human life, when to pray, when to fast, what to believe, Kant dared to suggest that morality need not rest in divine hands. That man could govern himself, through reason. Johannes, born the son of a Lutheran pastor, struggled with this. The sermons of his youth echoed in him still: fear God, obey God, love God. But Kant asked him a new question: what is it that moves you, if not God? He found himself writing late into the night, by candlelight, notes and treatises he dared not publish. He walked the streets of Berlin, eyes glazed with thought. If motivation came not from heaven but from within, then what was the source of that internal drive? What was the mechanism of will? One evening, he attended a lecture at the Academy of Sciences. The speaker, a physician turned philosopher, spoke on the mind as a biological engine, neurons and instincts, reflexes and reason. Johannes felt something shift again. Not just philosophy, but science now reached for the soul. The next morning, he began a new journal. Its first entry read, "I no longer believe that virtue is a gift from the gods. It is a muscle, one trained through reflection and choice. The divine is not above us, but within us, waiting to be uncovered." He felt both liberated and terrified. In the highlands of Japan, Akira's practice grew both deeper and more frustrating. The days became indistinguishable, and yet, something was shifting in him. The silence had grown less oppressive, less like an iron weight, and more like an invitation. He began to observe his own thoughts, noticing the fleeting patterns in his mind. Why do I crave the comforts of my former life? Why do I long to return? He began to see them not as weaknesses, but as transient thoughts, like clouds passing across an open sky. One crisp autumn morning, after a long session of meditation, Akira approached Ryushin with a question that had been forming for days. "Master, you once told me that suffering is my teacher. But now, I wonder, what is it that I seek in all this suffering? Is there something beyond the silence? What lies at the end of all this practice? Ryushin looked at him, his eyes sharp as the edge of his axe. For a long moment, the two monks simply stood there, the sound of the river in the background and the wind stirring the trees. Finally, Ryushin spoke, his voice calm, but with an underlying urgency. You seek nothing. The mind that seeks is the mind that suffers. The answer you look for is already in you, just as the flame is already in the spark. Akira was struck. He had always imagined enlightenment as a great revelation, a moment of divine clarity. But Ryushin's words shifted his understanding. Seek nothing. The words echoed in his mind. How could that be? He continued his practice, but now with a new lens. The discomfort, the restless thoughts, the longing for a return to his old life. He began to see them not as obstacles to overcome, but as reflections of his deeper self, constantly in flux. The more he sat in silence, the more he realized that the very nature of his suffering came from his desire for something external, something beyond himself. But if everything he sought was already here, in this moment, what did that mean for his motivation? The bell rang, signaling the end of his meditation. For the first time in months, Akira stood up with a sense of peace, not from the quiet of the room, but from an understanding of his own restless heart. He had not mastered his mind, but in some strange way, it no longer mastered him. Part 4. The Mechanics of Desire. In Berlin, Johannes Keller's intellectual journey had only just begun. The more he explored Kant's ideas of autonomy, the more he was drawn to the emerging field of psychology. It was no longer enough to merely understand what motivated people. It was now possible to observe how their minds worked. One cold afternoon, Johannes met a fellow student named Clara, a bright woman with a keen interest in the human mind. Over tea, they discussed Kant, philosophy, and the growing field of empirical science. I wonder, Clara mused, if motivation, at its core, is something we can break down scientifically. Can we explain human desire, and will not just through philosophy, but through biology? Johannes smiled, intrigued. You mean, as Kant suggested, that we are not simply influenced by divine will or external authorities, but are creatures of reason and biology? Exactly, Clara said. What if our desires, our motivations, can be reduced to something more than just abstract notions of morality? What if they have a physical origin? Johannes felt a spark. They spent hours talking, and soon their discussions began to circle around the work of emerging scientists. Figures like Charles Darwin and his ideas on evolution, and scientists like Franz Mesmer, who explored the idea of the human body's subtle energies. If motivation was a force of reason, as Kant suggested, could it also be an instinct, deeply embedded in the body? Johannes started to realize that his own work, which had once been purely philosophical, now had a biological dimension. Motivation was no longer a concept tied only to abstract thoughts about autonomy or divine will. It was also a mechanism, a force inside the human body, driving every action, every thought, every desire. One evening, after a particularly long discussion with Clara about the role of the brain in decision-making, Johannes wrote in his journal, "Autonomy is not the absence of motivation, but the mastery of it. The true question is not how to escape the forces that drive us, but how to understand them, to learn their roots, and then to guide them toward reason. In doing so, we free ourselves, not by ignoring the body or the desires, but by harmonizing them with the mind." It was an epiphany. He no longer saw motivation as a mere abstraction. It was a physical force that could be guided, shaped, and refined. Part 5. The New Horizon. Back in Japan, Akira found that his meditation practice began to open up new layers of understanding. As the days passed, he discovered that the suffering Ryushin spoke of was not to be avoided but embraced. Not because it was a punishment, but because it was an inherent part of the human condition. To deny it was to deny life itself. Yet, his understanding of suffering shifted. It was not something to conquer or escape, but to transcend, by seeing it not as an enemy, but as an integral part of his being. Through this realization, he started to glimpse something greater. The mind's constant striving for something more was not the root of his pain. It was the illusion that the external world held the answers he sought. In a moment of quiet reflection, as the golden light of dusk painted the temple walls, Akira understood that his motivation had shifted. His quest for enlightenment was not about mastering the mind or escaping suffering. It was about fully embracing the present moment as it was, without desire for anything else. In that stillness, he realized, true motivation comes not from external force or divine will, but from an inner harmony, an alignment of body, mind, and spirit. Months passed at the monastery, and Akira's understanding deepened. He now spent most of his days in quiet reflection, watching the interplay of thoughts without grasping at them. Meditation no longer felt like a struggle but a natural rhythm, like the ebb and flow of the river beside the temple. The winds of change that once rattled his heart now felt like whispers of wisdom. One late evening, as Akira sat before a candle, he thought of his family back in Edo, of his mother's gentle hands and his father's stern but loving gaze. He missed them, yes, but no longer with the gnawing hunger that had once consumed him. He felt a new kind of peace, one that arose not from the absence of longing, but from the understanding that longing itself was transient. Master Ryushin, Akira said, one morning as they worked together in the garden, I think I understand now. It is not the desire for enlightenment that I need to quell, but my attachment to it. True freedom lies in seeing all things, even longing, as temporary, and thus not letting them define me. Ryushin stopped for a moment, his gaze steady. Yes, the flame you sought was already within you. You are like the bamboo in the wind, not bending because you must, but bending because you are at peace with the movement. Akira stood still, the words unfolding in him like the petals of a lotus. It wasn't about mastery, not about forceful control, it was about allowing. The balance of life and suffering wasn't about avoiding or conquering. It was in the acceptance of what was, in the wisdom to know that all things come and go, just as thoughts arise and fade. The bell rang, signaling the beginning of evening meditation. Akira took his seat, no longer waiting for the stillness to arrive, for he realized it had always been with him. His heart, once full of questions, was now full of peace. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Johannes Keller stood on the precipice of a new intellectual era. The field of psychology, combined with his understanding of Kant's autonomy, had led him to a powerful conclusion. The mind is both a reflection of reason and a biological machine. True autonomy is found not in rejecting our instincts, but in mastering them through reason. It was no longer enough to theorize about the nature of motivation in abstract terms. Johannes began to work with Clara on practical experiments, mapping how the brain's structures responded to different stimuli. They were looking for patterns in human behavior, seeking the neural roots of desire, will, and motivation. They wanted to prove that reason and biology were not opposites, but rather two forces that could work together to guide human behavior. One evening, after a long discussion on the mechanisms of decision-making, Clara turned to him and said, "What we're really looking for is the intersection of the rational mind and the emotional body, aren't we? It's the place where reason meets desire." Johannes nodded. "Yes, I believe it's a place of perfect harmony. When we understand how to align our biological instincts with our reasoning mind, we can free ourselves from the forces that normally control us." As they continued their work, Johannes reflected on his journey. He had started with a question about autonomy and divine will, and now he saw the answer in a new light. True self-mastery wasn't about rejecting the forces of nature, nor was it about abandoning the divine. It was about understanding how to live with them, how to bring together reason and instinct, intellect and emotion. It was a realization that reminded him of a lesson he had read long ago in Kant. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. But now, Johannes understood this in a broader context. Enlightenment was not merely the abandonment of external authority, but the mastery of one's internal forces, achieved through the fusion of reason and nature. Part 7. The Return to the Self. Years later, Akira found himself standing on the edge of the same river where he had once arrived, a young man seeking something he could not name. The world around him had changed, yet the river continued its timeless flow. He had returned briefly to Edo, to visit his family, but even as he stepped into the bustling streets of the city, he realized he was no longer the same person who had left. He could not explain it in words, but the longing for something greater, the yearning that had driven him here, was gone. He had come to understand that the search for enlightenment, for self-mastery was not an external quest, but an internal one. He was no longer seeking something outside of himself. The fire within had become a quiet, steady warmth. On the evening of his departure from Edo, Akira stood before a shrine dedicated to the ancestors of his family. He bowed low, not in submission to the divine, but in gratitude. He understood now that the divine was not something external to be revered with fear. It was something inherent in all things, in the very breath he took. As he turned to leave, a sense of peace enveloped him. The questions that had once defined his life, who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of suffering? Had all faded into a gentle acceptance. His journey had not led him to answers, but to a new way of living. A life not defined by external motivations, but by an inner harmony, a place where reason, emotion, and spirit could finally meet in peace. Back in Berlin, Johannes Keller stood on the threshold of a new scientific breakthrough. His work on the brain and human motivation had led him to new discoveries, ones that showed how the brain's physical structures were intricately tied to our decisions, desires, and actions. But he also understood now that while we may be driven by biology, we are not slaves to it. The mind's capacity for reason allowed us to master our instincts, to guide our motivations consciously. It was a delicate balance between the rational mind and the emotional body. As he looked out over the city of Berlin, Johannes felt the quiet satisfaction of a journey that had begun with a single question: what moves us? And had unfolded into a deeper understanding of both science and spirit. In the end, both Akira and Johannes had arrived at the same conclusion. Motivation, the forces that drove the human spirit, could no longer be understood solely through divine will or biological instincts. True self-mastery came from understanding and harmonizing the forces within and around us, from the balance between reason, emotion, and the ever-present flow of life itself.